Good morning. Assalamu alaikum, Amira, our special representative on Islamophobia. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much for having me, Professor Kausar.
On behalf of Conflict and Resilience Research Institute and University of Winnipeg, I am deeply appreciative about your time and your energy that you agreed to speak to us today, and that means a lot because we work on the area of extremism and radicalization to violence prevention. Federal project that we wrapped up last December, and that also deserves another round of appreciation because you did speak with us from Ottawa virtually on 18th of October, the day we wrapped up. So today I thought of taking the advantage of time to touch base with you in person, and of course the workshop in the morning that you ran was very educative. And I do have some prepared questions and some from your workshop, and if you just kindly comment, and because your work is important at a very strategic level, and as a researcher we kind of work in between, from the grassroots to policy level, and there will be some discussions I intend to make today, that how do you see this bridging between policy and the grassroots level things. So to start with, Amira, I would like to go back to one of the questions of the one of the participants this morning, kind of alluded to. Um, the way I framed it, that why are we still speaking about 9/11? And of course, it is connected with the October 7. What do you think? What do you see?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much. Welcome to your viewers, and it's my pleasure to have this conversation. Being in Winnipeg is wonderful. It's cold, but it's but the people's hearts are warm, so it's really good to be here. I think it's very important that we talk about what I call sort of the legacy of the war on terror, on the sort of the amplification of Muslim as the other in our society. It's certainly not that Orientalism, or which is known by Professor Edward Said, who posited sort of the ways in which Muslims and Arabs are viewed by the West. That existed beyond and before 9/11, but 9/11 is such a seminal moment in the West in terms of, obviously a horrific, heartbreaking terrorist attack on 9/11 and the ramifications that it had on our communities, where it almost felt that overnight, our neighbors, our colleagues, our friends were looking at our communities in a much more negative, suspicious manner that was reflected in policies that were advanced. Although, there were efforts, for instance, the Prime Minister at the time, Jean Chrétien, did take his own initiative to go to the local mosque in my city where I live in Ottawa to say this is not about Canadian Muslims or Muslims communities. We cannot turn against each other. So he did make that statement, and that was very important. Nevertheless, though, we know that our communities were deeply impacted, and young people growing up in that era as well were impacted. There's books by various professors and academics who've studied that phenomenon and how it has influenced a variety, whether it's pop culture, whether it's the security apparatus, whether it's national security, whether it's looking at how even Canadian Muslim charities to this day are treated by federal policies. So part of my interest in actually taking this role was to help the federal government review and analyze policies that are harmful to our communities and sort of contradict human rights and contradict sort of the spirit of living in a democracy.
Thank you very much. It's a wonderful explanation of your work, your office's contribution. We also are very much interested about the phenomena of social polarization, particularly October 7th and aftermath, because not only in here in Manitoba where we live, globally, the situation of polarization is very palpable, and we do see in our social media, and on the streets, on the legislature. So, in terms of social polarization, community, connections, understanding, what do you see we are going with, and how do you see we should really talk about this with the young people, particularly when, like me, we teach courses and we get these questions often. And is there any guideline that your office is thinking about talking and reflecting on October 7th and aftermath?
Mm-hmm. So, as a special representative on combating Islamophobia, the role was created after the tragic killing of a family in London, Ontario, known as Our London Family. And there was a series of recommendations made to the federal government on a variety of issues impacting the rise of Islamophobia in our country. And those targeted various levels of government, federal, provincial, municipal, where there are ways in which we can bring people together, specifically look at policies that have harmed Canadian Muslim communities, but that writ large mean that there is a harm overall to our social fabric. So, in my role, I provide advice to the federal government. I look for community informed solutions to bring forward. And already, I think it's important for your viewers and listeners to know that the federal government has a national anti racism strategy, which really is about investing in communities themselves to address racism and division in their society. The federal government also launched a national action plan to combat hate earlier in the fall. Another really important initiative, again, to support the community led initiatives that do exist, because communities in their own localities will be able to best ascertain how do we build bridges, how do we create the spaces. It's not possible for me, not having lived in Winnipeg, not knowing Winnipeg folks, to understand what the dynamic here is like versus, say, Ottawa, where I grew up. So it really is about local initiatives and thinking about how are they supported by the various levels of government. Because at the end of the day, it cannot be off the backs of volunteers. It cannot be part-time work. This is deep work in supporting the connective tissue in our society, which is fraying for all the reasons you've just mentioned, Professor, where we talk about polarization, where we know that there are foreign actors deliberately stoking fear, deliberately advancing Islamophobic and other hateful narratives to create that instability in our democratic systems. So this is a really significant issue. And the other point to make is that in this time where online we're seeing this polarization, we also know that Canadians are having trouble distinguishing what is true from what is untrue, that this is in fact the greatest threat to our country, according to a federal report, that what is true, what is not true, is becoming more and more difficult to distinguish.
Thank you. It's interesting that you mentioned about, I think you alluded to actually to mis and disinformation that we kind of experience every day of our waking hours and every hours that we put on the screen in social media and all. And you are very right in saying that we don't have much energy to verify, information. And you have also heard by now that Facebook has already gotten rid of their fact-checking tools and all. So my question now here is, what kind of strategies you are suggesting, particularly to combat Islamophobia in social media and online spheres? The reason I'm saying, let me also give you a very quick context, because over the past 2 summers, here and nationally also, you might be aware that 1 million people's 1 million march for the children that happened, and we have seen tons of people gathered here, and the diversity of the groups, opponent versus, it was quite interesting in a sense that we have seen a mix of people on the other side, those who oppose the idea of to LGBTQ inclusion in the curricula and all these things. So, what do you think? And given your experience in this area, what kind of strategies will actually help people to understand, true from the fake?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, these are the questions that many people, far more educated and immersed in these issues, are themselves grappling with. So all I can share is what I hear from communities. What I hear is that there is a real need for further investment in media literacy in the schools, that there's more need for investment in in this case, anti-Islamophobia education. So I do want to applaud the government of Manitoba for being the first government in the country to implement K to 12 curricula that reflects anti-Islamophobia education and understanding. This is really important. What we need writ large is to ensure that folks, and I said this in the workshop, really have a good grasp of what it means to live in a democracy where human rights should be always protected for everyone. I think that is something that we have a lot of work to do. Many Canadians are not familiar with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, are not familiar with human rights codes, are not familiar with human rights complaints. And so all of these are crucial cornerstones of being able to live in dignity, have our rights respected. And this is really necessary at a time where we know that there is amplification of hate. There is those who benefit from division. There are those who, the algorithms are not making it any easier to find alternative information. And we know the federal government had proposed new online platform regulation. Right. Still hope for that, perhaps. It's really important that governments do take a leading role as well in addressing the proliferation of misinformation, disinformation, and hate, and the abuse of children and minors as well. It's the wild, wild west, as it's often described. There's no rules, really. And this is really a great, great challenge for anyone who's hoping to bring people together around shared values in our society.
Thank you again. One of my last questions this morning to you, sister, is about politics, the rhetorics of politics, the political activism that we see often are, I would say, not so conducive to the democratic values that we all aspire to be in this country. What are your thoughts? Have you encountered those things because you live in Ottawa, you work there? So how do you really balance these things with regards to our, freedom of expression and political rhetorics, which somehow targets minority groups? Is not uncommon in Canada. It's happening everywhere in the West.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think, again, as someone who provides advice to the federal government, to ministers, to the government, the way that I approach this is really to talk about division and how we need to really, again, support communities that are working across communities, across interfaith, intercultural. We need to support those efforts. It's, to borrow from, what we had to talk about during the pandemic, the idea of a vaccine against hate. Perhaps that's a little difficult. We don't want to think about pandemic again, but the idea here is during the pandemic, in fact, we saw a rise, for instance, in anti-Asian hate and racism, which tells us that what's happening around us can be manipulated by actors that want to see destabilization of our communities. So how do we protect against that? And the way to protect against that, amongst the various ways that I've heard from communities, again, is to invest in communities, to be able to hold programming that helps people come together, that educates folks, looking at our school systems, making sure that there are curricula that include religious literacy so people can understand about different faith communities as well as different cultural and ethnic communities, as well as, of course, hoping that Canadians see through efforts to win support based on division. That really goes against the most basic principles that we learned in kindergarten about being kind to each other, learning about sharing, learning about being open, and learning from each other. These are core principles that all of us should carry. And so particularly when we see economic distress, where we see the political instabilities that we've seen, it is an opportunity for certain voices to amplify what divides and scares, but the other path is really to bring people together. And so You know, I know that it might be very optimistic, but I think that Canadians do have a lot to continue to learn and unlearn about, for instance, relationships with Indigenous communities and what, how we approach truth and reconciliation. And those principles really apply to oppression against any community, right? Learning from Indigenous communities, the idea of, we live in a circle. And when more people join that circle, we widen the circle to welcome them. Canada, that's how Canada should be. It should be a ever growing, ever strong circle where no one feels unsafe, where no one sees their rights walked upon, and where everyone is really interested in a shared society where we can all be who we are and contribute to the very best of our potential.
Thank you so much, Amira. My last but one question about Suki, and you did mention today in your workshop your own observation about museum and how this exhibit has been displayed. And so the question is maybe a little bit of as a not as an academic but maybe a journalist. We have heard criticism about Canadian government's immigration policy towards Rohingyas because, of course, Canada is one of the lead countries which invested heavily in this issue, including the Honorable Bob Rae as our personal envoy and all these stuffs. But in terms of resettlement, we don't see Canada has really accepted Rohingyas so far. The last batch arrived in 2007 and 8, to the best of our research knowledge, and then that's all. So one of the things that we have seen, kind of criticized that is Islamophobia one of the factors with regards to resettlement plan of the Rohingyas because Rohingyas are Muslim, and I mean, what do you think? Because Rohingyas are one of the most persecuted groups in the world, and they are displaced. 1.3 million plus are living in Bangladesh, and only a few in Myanmar now. And since we do a lot of research on Rohingya crisis, I just was tempted to ask you this question. Do you think so? I mean, at this level, they are subjected to Islamophobia?
So, again, my role is domestic, and I can certainly provide advice to the federal government on domestic policies, including immigration policy. In terms of the Rohingya community, just recently, a few months ago, there was an arrivals of Rohingya to Canada. I know there's a commitment by the federal government to bring at least 10,000.
Correct.
And so they have started to arrive. I remember seeing an image at the airport with Rohingya people, I believe, coming.
Correct, two families, right?
Two families came. So certainly Canadians of a variety of backgrounds, including Canadian Rohingya who are here and Rohingya members who are here, will always ask questions around how are these policies open to our communities as compared to other communities. So one of the gold standards that we've seen in terms of resettlement has been the Ukrainian program. And that's wonderful. It's wonderful to see Canada open its arms to Ukrainian refugees who've wanted to resettle in Canada.
Correct.
And we know that Canada needs immigration from around the world to help fuel our country and support the aging population. So these are valid questions. They're asked about many different from diaspora communities, whether it's Rohingya, the Uyghur, Palestinian communities, Sudanese Canadians have been asking questions as well. They are valid questions. They are questions that I ask as well, having heard them from community. And the federal government needs to be responsive and to explain. But as I have heard and I have been told, every situation is very different. One community struggling to escape war and the difficult situation they're in, their challenges will be different from another that's escaping similar conditions, but they may have different circumstances. So it's difficult to apply a one size fits all. But that being said, those are questions that are asked, and as someone who's providing advice to the federal government on policies that impact Muslim communities in Canada, including those who are from the Rohingya diaspora, I have been asking those questions.
Thank you so much. Sichel, my last question to you. So at a personal level, you are doing a very tough job. and you might be handling questions every day. These are critical and tough. How do you handle all these questions? And then the last part of my questions: what are your hopes and fears for the future? How do you see Canada navigating? Because constantly we are bombarded whether multiculturalism is really a policy at work. So all these things, but I would like to listen from you. How do you every day manage all these questions about hate and all this, and your advice and your office, and of course talk us about your hopes and fears.
Well, thank you so much for the question. I think what I would say is I'm very privileged to be in this role. I take it very seriously. I have been a longtime human rights advocate and journalist. I remember a time where even using the term Islamophobia was contested in Canada, and it sadly took the killing of 11 Canadians for there to be unanimity about using the term Islamophobia. I could never have thought there would be an office to combat Islamophobia at the federal level. This represents hope and change. And recognition for this form of hatred in our society. And so I have a team of really dedicated public servants who work every day to help advance our mandate. There are folks within the federal public service deeply committed to this work and who support this office. And so, it's looking around and recognizing that many Canadians, when they sit down and they understand the challenges that our communities are facing in this country, whether it's economic integration due to bias that people can face, whether it's the attacks, sadly, that people are exposed to, whether it's just really being unable to bring their full selves into their spaces. I see a lot of sympathy. I see a lot of solidarity. And one poll actually found that nearly 50% of Canadians simply want more resources and tools to better support Canadian Muslim communities in solidarity. So maybe that's where I would end. Is my hope is that our office creates resources. We have a guide on Islamophobia, hopefully coming out soon. I encourage, your viewers, listeners, to sign up for our newsletter, receive that information, and to be an ally in their own spaces. So long as even if there's only one person left who looks at me and says, "I'm with you," then together we can do our very best to create a society that we're feeling that our children can thrive in.
Thank you so much, dear viewers. We are absolutely privileged to have Amira with us speaking this morning in Winnipeg about her office, her works, and there were lots of tough questions I threw at her, and I do apologize if as a researcher, we wanted to know what is going on in our country in general. So thank you once again on behalf of the Institute and our research. And as you are aware, Amira, we are working to educate our educators how to deal with the extremism and radicalization that might go on with their students. So we'll continue our work, and it is again, it's a wonderful event that we found Amira with us, and she spoke quite at length during the workshop this morning, and with us that the way the office works, advocacy, advice, and very soon a booklet on Islamophobia is coming out. So we'd earnestly request all to keep an eye, and you can subscribe to their newsletter. It will contain a lot of information. And together, it is important to conclude our today's discussion by saying that the country is ours and we have to leave. We have no option. We can't go back anywhere else, despite many might say that go back. So it doesn't work. So we have to work it out anyways the way. But I think Amira has a very valid point that empathy and connectivity with others are the most important glue of our social fabric. So with this, thank you very much, Amira,
Thank
for
you so much,
giving us
Professor
time.
Kessler.
Bye bye.
Thank you.